politicians have betrayed us. They'd rather do anything just to distract people from what needs to be done. So, I was, at the first, I used to be a milk farmer, and then organic beef. It's an organic farm. We've always tried to make it as wildlife friendly as possible because I've always been a fan of science and a lover of wildlife, and there we are. Let's make it louder for the helicopter. I think when you actually own a small part of the planet and feel responsible for it, it gives you a special perspective. It gives you, it makes you aware of the way the world is changing, the way the climate is changing, and the way that we can't do what we used to do on the farm. You don't notice it probably living in the city, but when you're entirely dependent on what the weather does for what you can do on your farm, you can recognise that the entire climate is changing, that we make organic hay on our farm because we've got ancient hay meadows which need to be preserved by following traditional techniques. And we've not mown them yet. The grass is still waiting there to be harvested, and that's very unusual. And this is the third year that that's happened, the first time in the history of the farm. So I can see that the climate is slowly breaking down, and what we want to do on the farm is becoming more difficult, and I can only see that getting worse in the future. I'm 62, but I'm very much afraid that I'm going to see complete climate collapse before I die, and that's a terrifying thing. And it's not a good way to finish your life, to be honest, seeing what you've loved just being destroyed by people who don't care. I've got a responsibility for my small part of the planet. I try to make it as good as I can. The politicians who we rely on are abdicating their responsibility because they don't care. They know, they've been thoroughly briefed on the climate crisis for the past 30 years. Mrs. Thatcher made a speech over 30 years ago now saying that climate change, global warming was going to be the greatest threat to humanity in the future. And if you lived through Mrs. Thatcher, you know that that was a very radical thing for her to say, because she went on to lead the most right-wing government we've had until the one we've got now. So I'm frightened for the future. I'm not just frightened for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years time. I'm concerned about next year, because soon we're going to be growing vegan organic vegetables and produce on the farm instead of producing meat or milk as we used to. I expect to produce much more actual food on a tiny area of the farm. The rest of the farm will be, well, we've got 17 cows who live on the farm now, and they're in retirement, and they're having a really good time. A fantastic organisation called Hillside in Norfolk are looking after the rest of the cows, as you probably know, if you've seen the story. The fact that those cows went to Norfolk now gives us a chance to do something different on our farm, because you know, all the cows had to live. We couldn't just get rid of them to make room for what we wanted to do. That's not what we're about. We have received help from the government for the past 20 years. Farmers have had good incentives to farm more environmentally friendly if they wanted to, but it's been voluntary. You had to be a real enthusiast, you had to go through a lot of paperwork, you had to be really determined to get the help that you needed. But we're now in high level stewardship, which makes it possible to have a very low output kind of farming. and you can maximise the wildlife value of your farm. So the government can do good things when they want to, but I'm afraid that wasn't the present administration that started that. I think it was under Ed Miliband that was refined. Well, that's me. Well, here we are, Smithfield, the most famous meat market in the world, I think, the most notorious. If you're concerned about animal welfare, this is the pit of hell. I'm glad you'll all, well, I'm glad you're all, I'm sure you'll all agree. And when you think about all the terror and suffering that animals have experienced here, I suppose whatever was, I think there's always been a meat market on this site, probably from 200 years ago when the city began to grow. And at first they would put the animals from the fields, from the farms, actually through the streets to here. And then they started to be trucked by railway and then lorries. And it's just a charnel house of misery. I know what these places are like because when we had the beef cows, we used to drive them to the abattoir ourselves. And you'd sort of drive around the back of the abattoir and there were pens full of animals waiting to die, and you had to open the back of your trailer and goad your poor animals out into one of these pens and abandon them. And I knew I was betraying them. I knew that after looking after them and keeping them happy as well as you could on the farm, that you did this ultimate betrayal, and I know that they knew what was going to happen. I can smell the smell of meat here. I can smell the smell of death. And believe me, when you visit an industrial abattoir, the sights, the sounds, the smells, when you get round the back where the public don't see, it's not something that's easy to take. A personal anecdote, we'd unloaded some cows one day and I heard a sort of a strange bump, bump, bump noise, and I looked round and there was like a chute coming out the side of the building, and a cow's head came down the chute and landed in a skip, and I thought, bloody hell, what am I doing? I can't do this anymore. And so I regret every life that I mean, you see, this kind of agriculture has taken place for at least 2,000 years since people began to build settlements, and they realised that it was easier to keep animals in pens and keep them to house them and feed them, and then they were just there when we wanted to kill them to eat. It might have made sense 2,000 years ago when people were just surviving, but it just doesn't make sense anymore. 70% of the world's farmed area is devoted to feeding livestock. And only a tiny proportion of the feed value of that 70% of the cultivated area actually ends up on people's plates. If you don't care about animal suffering, if you've got no morals, if you just don't care, you can't be bothered, you just want some cheap food, you've got to admit that that's a fantastically inefficient way of feeding the world. It can't go on. And even now, the British government are promoting British meat in places like India, China. There are delegations going to places that don't eat enough British meat to expand our export market now. That's just insane. because we only produce 60% of the food we eat in this country anyway. It isn't as if British farming works now. It isn't a great success story. It isn't something to be defended. It's a disaster. I mean, I don't know if you watch Country Farm, but one of the cliches is they sweep the camera across somewhere in Yorkshire or the Lake District and say, oh, today we're visiting Windermere and the beautiful countryside, the hills that we all love so much. And you look at them and you see thousands, millions of sheep. And it's just a green desert. I know George Monbiot said that. It really is. It's nothing like the countryside could be. It's nothing like it ought to be. And it's nothing like it needs to be if we're going to survive the next 20 years. We need to change the way we do everything, and the way we feed ourselves and the way we treat animals and the way we feed ourselves has got to change now. I mean, if you don't care about the animals, if you don't care about the countryside, if you don't care about climate change, do you care about your own health? Because just this morning it was in the news that the NHS are going to start giving people with diabetes diet packs. I know it's not entirely, not directly connected to animal agriculture and animal food, but it just shows the power of people's diet to change their lives. They say they can reverse type 2 diabetes by altering people's diet. I'm sure a large part of that is getting people's weight down, it's getting their cholesterol down, and it's making them aware of what they're eating. And I think if you go vegan, you really start to think about what you eat. You're responsible for what you eat. It's cheaper, it's healthier, it's easier on your state of mind, because you just know that you're not jeopardising the world and you're not responsible for the death of millions of animals. The guy who started one of Europe's biggest poultry firms lives next door to me, and one of their workers told me they slaughter 4 million chickens every week. Can you imagine that number of lives being ended? And all over the area where I live, they've got these production facilities with intensive poultry houses, and these trucks roll past our gate full of plastic cages, just plastic boxes basically. And you can see these poor things, they can't even stand up. And in fact, one day one of the cages broke open as they went past, and we rescued some of these chickens from the road. And we tried to look after them, but I think the thing was that they're bred to live a certain number of days, and when they they just haven't got any life left in them. They're so artificially bred. They're not a real chicken anymore. They're a thing. I know they experience pain, they experience terror, but to see what intensive farming does to the animals in that way, it's just sickening. It really is sickening. And I'll look at my notes to see what else I've got to say.
You're doing amazing, Jane!
Lisa wanted to say something about that we've got a pandemic at the moment. It's widely believed that came from what's euphemistically known as a wet market somewhere in China or Asia, where wild animals are just put in cages. I've seen them on videos. They just throw the cages about as if it's a cage full of footballs, not a cage full of animals. They've got no respect for the animals at all. It's just sickening. And all the major, the SARS, AIDS, all these diseases have come from animals that we should just leave them alone to get on with their lives. And of course, livestock farming, intensive livestock farming, because they keep the animals so close together in such artificial circumstances. If they have a disease outbreak, it can wipe the entire shed of animals out. In fact, occasionally we can smell the smell of roast chicken in the air. And you know, they've had a shed of chickens up the road, the temperature control's gone wrong, they've had a disease outbreak, the entire shed has died, and they just burn them in a pyre. So you know that's intensive farming for you. Okay, so we're trying to change what we do on the farm. The Vegan Society are helping us, the Vegan Organic Network are showing us how we can produce more food from our farm than we ever did by farming cows for milk or beef. And so we're hoping to make a change for the better, and it sounds grandiose, but we're hoping to show a model that other farmers can follow if they want to, and we're hoping that DEFRA will begin to encourage this kind of farming and withdraw support from animal farming, because it just doesn't make sense anymore. It's not economically sustainable. People producing milk say, oh, we're paying to produce the milk. Well, why are you doing it? Just because your dad and your granddad did it? Do something else, you know, anything else, basically. Plant trees. Anyway, the vegan organic ideal is that a third of the present cultivated land, that is all cultivated land which is ploughed at the moment, could produce all the food that Britain needs, all the food that Britain needs using the vegan organic system. And so we'd free up vast areas that could be rewilded or reforested. We need to plant masses of trees to draw down some of that CO2 and improve the air quality and improve amenity. And yeah, so we've got human health, animal suffering, climate crisis. Question veganism is the answer. And I think if there's one thing that's short in the world at the moment, it's compassion. Compassion for each other, compassion for people trying to escape from war zones, from persecution. It's in the news every day. I think if we start with compassion for animals, we'll gradually get to a point where we'll respect all life forms, no matter what they are. And so, thanks for being here, and thanks for listening to me.